I never expected my boss's sister to notice me, but when she laughed and said, "Don't worry, I'll go easy on you," maybe, everything changed. The first time I met her, I didn't know what to expect. My new job had me nervously navigating the polished office corridors, trying to memorize names and faces without looking like a complete outsider. Then she appeared, a quiet force of presence that made the bustling room seem almost still. My boss's sister. She wasn't just striking, there was a calm confidence in her every movement, a grace that felt effortless, yet deliberate. Her laughter, warm and slightly teasing, carried across the room, and for a moment I was caught off guard, unsure if she was talking to me or just part of the casual chatter. She approached with that easy, self-assured smile that made the corners of her eyes crinkle just enough to soften the intensity. "Ah, so you're the new guy," she said, her tone teasing, light enough to disarm, yet sharp enough to make my heart stutter. There was no malice in her words, only that playful curiosity that makes someone simultaneously intimidating and magnetic. I extended my hand, and as ours met, I felt the warmth of her touch linger longer than necessary, almost intentionally. Her fingers were smooth, confident, and as she withdrew her hand, I caught a faint whiff of her perfume, subtle, comforting, with a trace of something warm and familiar I couldn't name. I tried to focus, to respond with something witty, but my thoughts scattered under the weight of her gaze. It wasn't just her beauty, it was the way she held herself, the way she seemed completely aware of her surroundings yet entirely present with me. When she laughed again, the sound brushed against my nerves like sunlight through leaves, and I realized I was smiling before I even knew why. She leaned slightly closer as she offered a casual piece of advice about the office, her shoulder brushing mine ever so lightly. That brief contact, almost accidental, sent a small, unsteady thrill through me. I was painfully aware of it, the closeness, the warmth, the effortless connection that seemed to spark in silence. And yet, beneath the playful exterior, there was a subtle vulnerability in her eyes, a hint that she carried stories and experiences beyond her confident poise. As our conversation ended, she gave me one last teasing smile, her eyes holding mine a heartbeat too long. "Don't worry too much," she said, her voice softening, "you'll figure it out." And just like that, she walked away, leaving me with an echo of her presence that I couldn't shake, and a feeling I didn't yet understand, that my life had shifted in a single, fleeting moment, and that this meeting was only the beginning of something I wasn't ready to name, but already couldn't ignore. Working together was unexpected, yet somehow inevitable. Our first assignment was simple on paper, a small project that required us to sit side by side and sort through documents. But in that quiet, ordinary setting, every glance, every gesture seemed amplified. I noticed how her hand moved over the papers with ease, fingers brushing the edges just so, and I found myself wanting to imitate her, to mirror her calm efficiency. She noticed, too, but instead of mocking, she gave a small, approving nod, and for a second, our eyes met, a fleeting connection that sent warmth crawling up my spine. Our conversation began with logistics, casual questions about deadlines and procedures. But it quickly drifted to stories, memories, little jokes that made her laugh in a way that felt unguarded, almost intimate. Every laugh seemed to hang in the air longer than expected, wrapping around the space between us. When she leaned in to point out a correction on a document, her elbow brushed mine. The touch was light, accidental maybe, yet I felt it in a way I couldn't ignore, a current that traveled from the tip of my fingers up to the knot in my chest. I wanted to pull back, remind myself this was professional, but instead, I stayed, frozen in a moment I didn't want to end. She had a way of noticing small things about me, the way I adjusted my posture when I was nervous, the subtle hesitation before I spoke. She commented lightly, almost teasing, on my meticulous notes, and the warmth of her words made me aware of how deeply I wanted her approval. At the same time, I noticed a softness in her eyes, a patience that invited honesty, a quiet encouragement that made it easier to be myself. As the project continued, we fell into a rhythm, sharing ideas, papers, and occasional glances that lingered just a beat too long. Her shoulder occasionally brushed mine as we reached for the same folder, her proximity both comforting and electrifying. I caught myself stealing glimpses at the curve of her smile, the way her hair fell across her cheek, and felt a strange mix of exhilaration and restraint. By the time the work was done, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't just about finishing a project. It was about these small, intimate moments that felt larger than their simplicity. Every brush of a hand, every shared laugh, every patient look from her seemed to leave an imprint on me, a quiet imprint that tugged at a part of me I hadn't recognized before. As she stood to leave, her eyes met mine again, warm and knowing, and I felt that unspoken truth settling between us. Something had begun, subtle and slow, and I wasn't ready to let it go. It happened one quiet evening, long after most of the office had emptied. I was gathering my things when I noticed her still at her desk, her expression softened by the dim glow of the desk lamp. She seemed different, quieter, more human than the poised, confident woman I had been captivated by these past weeks. And for reasons I couldn't name, I felt compelled to stay a little longer, to see the world behind the polished exterior. She glanced up as I approached, and for a moment, there was a flicker of surprise before her soft, welcoming smile returned. "Still here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a hint of fatigue. I nodded, fumbling for words, unsure if I should leave or stay. Somehow, she gestured for me to sit, and without a word, the quiet settled between us, not awkward, but expectant, as if space itself was holding its breath. She began to speak, almost casually at first, about a past she rarely revealed, challenges she had faced, moments of doubt, and losses that had shaped her quietly. Her voice trembled just slightly, betraying the vulnerability she usually kept tucked away. As I listened, I felt a strange pull, a mixture of empathy, admiration, and a growing desire to be closer, to offer some small comfort in the world she had opened to me. Then, without thinking, she reached out, placing her hand lightly on my arm. It was a simple gesture, but the warmth of her skin pressed against mine was grounding, almost electrifying. Her touch lingered just long enough to communicate trust, to invite connection without words. I wanted to pull away out of nervousness, but I didn't. Instead, I let it settle over me, noticing the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the faint scent of her perfume, and the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat beneath my fingertips. In that moment, the air between us seemed charged with unspoken truths. I realized that the careful, playful distance we had maintained until now had shifted. I could see her fatigue and her grace, her strength and her hidden tenderness. And though I didn't say anything, I felt our bond deepen, an unspoken promise forming in the soft, shared space. When she finally withdrew her hand, a small, wistful smile lingered on her lips. "Thank you for listening," she said softly. And in her eyes, I saw a mixture of relief and something else, a subtle invitation, a quiet recognition that our connection was no longer just casual, no longer just friendly. I left that evening with a new awareness. Something fragile and beautiful was unfolding, and I couldn't stop thinking about how much I wanted to be part of it, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. It started with the smallest of gestures, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. That weekend, the company had organized a casual outing, a simple mix of laughter, food, and idle chatter. I had tried to focus on blending in, on keeping my excitement for her carefully buried. But being near her made that impossible. She moved through the crowd with an easy confidence, a natural elegance that drew attention without demanding it. And yet, every now and then, she would glance in my direction, and the weight of her gaze was enough to make my chest tighten. We found ourselves walking together along the edge of the gathering, conversations overlapping but our focus quietly narrowing to each other. When she leaned slightly closer to hear what I was saying over the hum of voices, the brush of her shoulder against mine sent a subtle current through me. It was just a touch, accidental, casual, maybe, but I could feel it, every nerve alert. I realized with a mix of thrill and dread that I was holding my breath. She teased me, as usual, in that soft, playful way that both calmed and provoked me. "You're awfully quiet today," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I laughed, trying to match her ease, but my words stumbled. I could feel her subtle shift closer, the faint warmth of her body brushing mine when she adjusted her step. It was a dance, a silent conversation carried entirely by proximity, glances, and small, deliberate gestures. Even something as mundane as sharing a blanket from a picnic basket became charged with quiet electricity. The fabric brushed our arms, her hand briefly resting near mine, and the small warmth of her presence was enough to make me painfully aware of my own racing heartbeat. I wanted to look away, to regain composure, but instead I let myself notice the tilt of her head, the gentle curve of her smile, the subtle way she lingered in conversation, as if unwilling to let this closeness go. I caught myself thinking about the unspoken rules we were tiptoeing around, the age gap, the workplace boundaries, but the tension between us was undeniable, a delicate thread that made every touch and glance feel significant. It wasn't bold, it wasn't reckless, it was subtle, slow, and unbearably intimate in its restraint. By the time the outing ended, I was left with that lingering, insistent thought: every small movement, every brush of her hand, every pause in her laughter was a promise, or perhaps a question, that I couldn't yet answer. And somehow, I hoped she felt it too. It started with a simple awareness, a quiet voice inside me that whispered warnings I couldn't ignore. I liked her, more than I should, perhaps, more than the world might allow. The age gap, her connection to my boss, the unspoken expectations of professionalism, all of it weighed on my conscience like stones in my chest. Every time I thought about the moments we had shared, the brush of a shoulder, the warmth of her hand, the quiet laughter that felt meant just for me, I felt both exhilaration and dread. One evening, as we lingered after a meeting, the tension between us was almost tangible. I noticed the way she studied me, her expression calm but mischievous, as if she could read every thought racing behind my careful composure. "You seem tense," she said softly, her voice teasing, yet threaded with curiosity. I shifted uncomfortably, trying to hide the storm of emotions churning inside. And then she said it, playful, daring, and impossible to forget: "Don't worry, I'll go easy on you, maybe." The words hung in the air, teasing, light, but the way she looked at me made it clear they carried far more weight than mere jest. My stomach tightened, and I felt a blush creep up my neck. That one line crystallized everything I had been suppressing: desire, fear, hope, and hesitation, all tangled together. Her hand brushed mine casually as she handed over a stack of documents, but in that small gesture, the world seemed to shrink. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric, the subtle pressure of her fingers against mine, and the faint, lingering scent of her perfume that made my thoughts spiral. Every nerve in my body was alert, every instinct screaming that this was dangerous, yet intoxicatingly real. I wrestled with myself for days after, questioning my motives, my restraint, my sanity. Was I reading too much into her smiles and glances? Was the closeness we shared merely innocent familiarity, or something more? Every interaction, no matter how casual, became a minefield of emotion. Yet, the pull toward her was undeniable, impossible to ignore. It was also clear she noticed my hesitation. Sometimes her eyes would soften, her gaze lingering in a way that suggested patience, understanding, and an almost imperceptible invitation. Other times, the playful spark would return, teasing me as if daring me to take a risk. The tension between us was no longer subtle, it had grown into a quiet storm, unspoken but palpable, leaving me constantly aware of how deeply I wanted her, and how painfully aware I was of all the reasons I shouldn't. By the end of the week, I realized one thing with painful clarity: my heart was no longer mine to protect. And though fear and longing wrestled inside me, I couldn't stop thinking about the warmth of her hand, the curve of her smile, and the promise in her teasing words that had unsettled me from the very first touch. The turning point didn't happen in a grand declaration or a dramatic moment, it was quiet, almost imperceptible, and yet utterly transformative. It began one evening after work when we found ourselves walking side by side, the city streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. There was no agenda, no work to discuss, just the gentle hum of evening air and the subtle comfort of her presence beside me. At first, I tried to maintain composure, keeping my thoughts tucked safely away. But as we walked, I noticed how natural it felt to match her pace, to adjust unconsciously to her rhythm. Every so often, our shoulders brushed, sending a small, steady warmth up my arm, a subtle reminder that we were sharing this space together, uninterrupted and intimate. We spoke sparingly, our conversation punctuated by pauses that were neither awkward nor strained. In those silences, I became acutely aware of her, the soft tilt of her head as she listened, the calm rise and fall of her breath, the gentle way she shifted her weight, subtly leaning closer at moments that felt almost instinctual. I realized, with a startling clarity, that the world around us had faded, it was just the two of us, and nothing else mattered. Finally, I spoke, my voice low, tentative, almost afraid of shattering the fragile connection we had built. I admitted my feelings, not in grand declarations, but in quiet honesty. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked beside me, her hand brushing mine just enough to anchor me, and I felt the electricity of our proximity deepen into something steadier, something real. Then, almost imperceptibly, she allowed herself to rest her hand on my arm, letting her warmth settle over me. I felt my chest loosen, tension melting into an unfamiliar comfort, a sense of trust that had taken weeks to build. Her touch was gentle, deliberate, and grounding, an acknowledgement of everything unspoken between us. For the first time, it felt safe to admit how much I wanted her presence, how much I needed the closeness that had been quietly growing since our first encounter. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, patient, and full of quiet understanding. I felt it too, she admitted, her eyes meeting mine with that same steady warmth I had come to crave. The simplicity of her confession was astonishing. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, just a truth shared, a bridge built. By the time we parted that evening, a sense of calm satisfaction settled over me. There was no rush, no urgency, just the knowledge that we had crossed a threshold together, that the unspoken tension and longing had transformed into mutual acknowledgement. Our connection had evolved, slow and deliberate, and it felt as though the world had shifted in the smallest, most perfect way, closer, warmer, undeniably ours. The days that followed felt different, as if the world itself had shifted in subtle, comforting ways. There was no sudden leap into romance, no dramatic confession or cinematic moment, but a gentle unfolding that made every encounter with her feel like coming home. Our connection, once charged with uncertainty and longing, had settled into something quiet, tender, and real. We began to spend more time together outside of work, in moments carefully chosen yet unforced, a coffee in a nearby cafe where sunlight warmed the table, quiet walks through parks where leaves crunched softly beneath our feet, and evenings spent sitting on a balcony, sharing small stories and laughter that seemed to linger long after the words were spoken. Every shared space became charged with a subtle intimacy, and yet safe in its warmth, free from the pressure of labels or expectations. Physical gestures remained soft, deliberate, and profoundly affectionate. Her hand would brush against mine when she reached for her cup, a fleeting touch that sent a thrill through me while simultaneously grounding me. Sometimes she rested her shoulder lightly against mine as we walked, a small but intimate reminder that we belonged, in that moment, to each other. And the way she looked at me, the calm steadiness of her gaze, the subtle sparkle of amusement and care in her eyes, made me feel truly seen, in a way I had never experienced before. We spoke honestly, too, about our fears, our hopes, and the delicate nature of our bond. There was no rush, no pressure, only the shared understanding that we were navigating something rare and fragile, yet infinitely rewarding. I began to realize that the age gap, the social expectations, even the initial hesitation, they mattered far less than the quiet certainty I felt when she was near. One evening, as we lingered on a park bench under the soft glow of lamplight, our hands brushed deliberately. I took a breath and let my fingers entwine with hers, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had felt but never fully said. She leaned slightly closer, resting her head on my shoulder for just a heartbeat, and I felt the warmth of her presence fill me completely. The world seemed to shrink, leaving only the steady rhythm of our hearts and the comforting weight of mutual understanding. By the time we parted that night, I knew we had crossed an invisible threshold, our connection had evolved into something enduring, tender, and undeniably ours. There was no dramatic climax, just a slow, perfect unfolding of trust, warmth, and affection that left me smiling long after I had walked away. I had found in her not just desire, but solace, not just laughter, but a quiet intimacy that promised something lasting, beautiful, and wholly human. And in that slow, steady realization, I understood that some romances don't need fireworks, they only need presence, patience, and the gentle certainty of being seen, accepted, and cherished. If you felt the slow burn tension and warmth in this story, don't miss the full journey. Click the link in the description to watch the complete story unfold.